Okay. We published a booklet, or republished a booklet. It was a little biographical sketch of General John Stark. Now, we all know who General Stark is? Live free or die. He was a famous general. And my wife and I were at a place called Fun Spot, the world's largest indoor arcade in Laconia, Weirs Beach, Laconia, last year. And I realized that the owner, his last name was Larson, Mr. Robert Larson, who passed away last fall at the age, he was in his 90s. But when I got to the restaurant, that was in the summer, it said that he was the state rep that sponsored the bill back in the 70s to put it on the license plate. I says, well, let me go grab a copy of the booklet. It'll be, and I didn't meet Mr. Larson, but I met one of his daughter-in-laws, and she gave it to him. And at his funeral, it was on display. And that's how Mr. Wright called me. He said, oh, I saw your booklet. I want to, and I said, you're a John Stark reenactor? Can you come to camp? And he said, absolutely. So, Mr. Richard Wright is here as a General John Stark reenactor. General.
Well, thank you. So we already told you my name's Richard Wright. I am a blacksmith. You can't hear it? Oh, is it not on?
Make sure it's on. Touch it with your hands, make sure it's on. Yeah,
It's on.
Put it up to your mouth.
Put it up to my mouth.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a large enough mouth. You can't hear me out there? Really?
Bring it up.
Bring it up. Well, anyway, I do a little different type presentation because I know it's very warm and everybody just ate, so I don't want anybody falling asleep. So typically I do questions and answers. I ask the questions, you guys give me the answers. How's that going to work? No? You've all read the book, right? Wow. Guess you need more volume. Where are you going to get that? Is that better? So somebody back there put the volume up. It wasn't me. So I guess Hal lied to me when he said you guys all read the book. So who was John Stark? Who can tell me that? Wow. We need a little more interaction here.
Stand up to answer the question, please.
A general in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, I guess he was. But that's not who he was. John Stark was born in Londonderry, section of town now Derry, in 1728. Everybody know where Derry, New Hampshire is? Anybody know where Derry, New Hampshire is? Wow, what a crowd.
Teach.
Huh. How about you guys? So, when he was about 8 years old, the house burnt down, and his father, Archibald, moved to Derryfield, which is now Manchester. So, everybody know where Manchester is?
Yeah.
Well, at least we got a little bit of response there. And when he first moved there, he met a Native American called Christo, who was there fishing in the springtime. And they became good friends. And John Stark learned a lot about how to live with nature and what to take and what not to take and how much to take, which was important later in his life and military career. So a little bit later on, I guess, when he was about 24 years old, he was out trapping spring beaver in Rumney on the Baker River. Anybody know where Polar Caves is? Nobody goes out to scenic sites anymore. We got one. It's over by Plymouth, where the college is, and Route 25 that goes up to Haverhill. So while they were trapping spring beaver, you know why they trap spring beaver? What do they do with the beaver?
What do they pack and,
In the springtime, like chickens, beaver molt. They lose that heavy guard hair that protects them from the icy cold water. And they put on a new fluffy down, an undercoat. And that was in demand by all the fur traders to make hats. This is a beaver felt hat. But the natives were also traders with the French and Dutch. So they captured John Stark, Amos Eastman, and took him up to Lower Coos, which is now Haverhill. And they finished trapping, and then took him to St. Francis, to the reservation of the Abenaki tribe. And they made him run the gauntlet. Anybody know what the gauntlet is? No? What do you think the gauntlet is? No idea. We have an opposing group of braves, all with clubs, and you have to run through while they try to hit you. But this is actually not for punishment usually. It's how braves test their ability and agility as a game for young Native Americans. So as you become of age and want to get to go out trapping with the men, you have to prove your worth and that you can survive these little tests of endurance. So Stark runs and he grabs a club and he hits the other guy's back as he's running down that gauntlet. The chief was so impressed that they made him a member of the tribe. And they put him to work in the cornfield. Well, in those days, hoeing corn was not work for men. This was to work for the women. So Stark cut all the corn off at the roots and then threw his hoe in the water and said, "I won't do this. This is women's work." So now the chiefs are even more impressed. They're laughing. They think this is really funny. So he spent the whole rest of that summer and into the next winter as a member of the tribe and running his own trap line with them. He was very well respected. The next year, they paid a ransom, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, of some people say $103, and some people say 50 ponies, but whatever. They bought him back. But Stark never forgot his experiences with the natives and what he learned. Later on, he goes with Robert Rogers. Anybody know who Robert Rogers was? Yeah, well, maybe somebody ought to get the book Northwest Passage or something. We need to have some more due diligence and less screen time. You can probably Google it, though. No doubt. Robert Rogers was from Dunbarton, New Hampshire, where John's father-in-law lived, later to be his father-in-law. And they were paid to run and do surveying up through the Lower Coos in that area where they had captured Stark a few years earlier. And they met up with some Indians and had a confrontation. And Stark says to Rogers, "You know, you're going to start a war." And Rogers says the war is inevitable. And it was just a short time after that the French and Indian War broke out, what is called the America's First World War, or 7 Years' War. Stark was a senior captain under Robert Rogers, the only one ever to command Rogers Rangers except Rogers himself. In 1759, Rogers led a raid on St. Francis because natives were coming down and being a little disruptive, I guess. And Stark wouldn't go. He wouldn't take arms against his brother. And so at that time, Stark was asked to run the Crown Point Road, make the Crown Point Road from Crown Point, New York to Charlestown, New Hampshire, where Fort at number 4 is. Anybody ever been to Fort 4? 1. We only got 1 kid in the whole place that's been something. We got 2, oh no. I lived there for 3 years, 12 months out of the year, in the 18th century. So my 18th century knowledge is not from a book, it's from actual lifestyle of the 18th century. I've walked the Crown Point Road twice. Today it's 100 miles. Stark may have stretched the truth a little bit in 1759 because he reported that it was 87 miles across Vermont, no swamps, no mountains. Well, I have to say, now we got a few obstacles in the way, cities and towns, but it is a little bit longer than 87 miles, and there are mosquitoes, so that tells me there would be some swamps nearby. Pretty sure. So then the French and Indian War is over. And I know we got a couple of people here from Lexington, Massachusetts. What happened in Lexington, Massachusetts?
April 19, 1776. The regulars are coming.
The regulars are on the march, that's correct. However, 2 years before that, in 1774, at Fort Constitution, Fort William and Mary, over in Newcastle, what happened there? Anybody know? That's really the first time the British ensign, or flag, was taken down by patriots. It's to raid on William and Mary, December 1774. Nobody knows why, right? Paul Revere had made that first ride to warn of the British probably going to do a blockade at very least. And even though the British soldiers at Fort William and Mary weren't in great health, they still kept guard on a bunch of gunpowder and shot. So they took that gunpowder down to Lexington and Concord from Fort William and Mary. And we know what happened to Lexington. So you all read in books, and this is a little bit difficult to understand in 1776, but the surrounding towns and militias answered the alarm. Well, what do you think that meant? Where did we get all the history buffs? So, we didn't have smartphones. Route 93 wasn't quite built yet. It may have started just after the Revolution, and it's probably almost finished. But there was no telephones, cell phones, telegraph. There wasn't even a stagecoach yet. So they had post riders, like Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, who would ride to towns and villages throughout the colonies, warning of the British getting too big for their britches. It was all about taxation without representation, very similar to what we have today, I'm afraid. We haven't learned a thing in 200 years. So when you think about they answered the alarm, they weren't there in time for the battle. The battle was all gone. The regulars had marched back to Boston. And so Stark and to start with, about 700 or 800 New Hampshire men went down to Medford. They set up a camp at what was Isaac Royal's farm. Pretty much commandeered the farmland from Isaac Royal. And men would come and go from April till June in 1775. They keep going and going and going and going. Back to the farm, check on the crops, make sure everything's okay, go back in, back and forth. It's a little different than the military today, because people had things to do and crops to attend to. But on the 16th of June, Stark walks out Charlestown Neck. Anybody ever drive down to Boston? You get a lot of time to look at scenery if you do. Sitting on that road that's not quite done yet. Charlestown Neck is, you know where Bunker Hill is?
Yeah.
Well, okay. That gets us close to Charlestown Neck. It's a strip of land between the Charles River and the Mystic River that runs out into the harbor. And that's where the Battle of Bunker Hill would have been. So Major McCleary from Epsom and John Stark walk out there and take a look at it. They see the rail fence. And this is a little unknown little fact, a little confusing, I guess. Or not confusing, but bewildering to me. The fellow that owned the fields on Charlestown Neck was from Holderness, New Hampshire. And 93 wasn't built yet. That's a long ride in a wagon to bring hay. So they took the hay that was there and they stuffed the rail fence and made it look like earthworks so that the British would think that they had something that they had to overcome. So on June 17th, the British landed 2,300 Welsh Fusiliers on Charlestown Neck. And they met John Stark and about, by this time, 1,500 New Hampshire men. A good number of them were veteran French and Indian War veterans. And the regulars had been told that the colonists had pitchforks and rakes, and they weren't very well armed, and nothing like that would happen. And, you know, this is going to be easy. We're just going to. So the Fusiliers charged the rail fence and met with a huge volley of colonial muskets. So they all backed down and regrouped, made a second assault, again unsuccessful. And I know I don't know in this group. I think everyone ought to know. But anyone ever hear, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes?
Yeah.
Everyone thinks that Prescott said that from Massachusetts. He didn't say it. Stark took a stick, walked out 17 rods, or 16 rods, which is 16 times 16. Put the stake in the ground and told his men not to fire until the Fusiliers reached that stake. And they didn't, and it worked twice. The third time, they were out of ammunition and gunpowder. So Stark made a tactical withdrawal, not a retreat. Nobody turned and ran. He backed down off the neck to Medford to come back and fight another day. So that was a very victorious battle at Bunker Hill. Even though it wasn't a real victory, it was a victory for the moral character and how the colonists viewed their ability to defend their cause. So then we evolved with a few years, a few other battles. Stark does a lot militarily. He's passed over for general, and Enoch Poor is promoted over Stark. And Enoch Poor was not a good general. He was not a good strategist, but he was a pretty good politician. So he got promoted and Stark didn't. So Stark says, I'm going back to my sawmill in Manchester, Derryfield, and just rest up for the rest of the war. It's probably over anyway. So he goes back in March of 1777. He gets a letter shortly after arriving back in Derryfield from John Langdon in Exeter, who asked him, he's answering the New Hampshire Grants, which is now Vermont, had sent a letter to Langdon asking for help to stop Burgoyne's advance to Bennington. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne had ordered 1,500 mounts for Hessian troops, food and supplies to be stored in Bennington. That's why Bennington was crucial. It was like a depot, storage depot for men and horses. So again, at Fort Number 4, and approximately the location where the fort is today, Stark mustered the New Hampshire men again. Another 1,600 men showed up when he sounded the alarm, raised his standard, which would have been his flag. He didn't have a cell phone yet. So they marched from about 800 or 900 of those men were battle ready. The others were either too old or infirm to make the march over to Manchester. Stark makes the march over to Manchester, Vermont, where he meets General Lincoln. And General Lincoln says, you have to go to Albany. Stark says, I'm not going to Albany, I'm going to Bennington. Well, no, Continental Congress says you're going to Albany. He said, I don't care what the Continental Congress says. I work for New Hampshire. I don't work for them. And we're going to Bennington. And if you talk to the park rangers at Saratoga, they'll tell you that Stark was only there circumstantially. It was just an accident. But it was, if you read a couple of diaries that are down in the New Hampshire Historical Society, you'll find out that that was Stark's plan, to go to Bennington to stop the storage and stores and Bennington's advance of the Hessians. So they get down, they leave, they stop the argument with Lincoln because Lincoln's face was all turning red. Stark wrote that he thought General Lincoln was going to have a seizure. So he stopped the argument, gathered his men, and marched down to Bennington. Anybody been to the Bennington battle site? It's not in Bennington, is it? The battle site's in Walloomsic, New York, which is about 7 miles from Bennington proper. So they're down there, and it's raining, August, lousy weather. Can't fire a musket in the rain. Doesn't like it. Gunpowder turns to mud. So Reverend Allen from the Berkshires, he jumps up on a stump and he says, I brought my men from Berkshire County, Massachusetts. We're here for a fight. Excuse me. And John Stark says, well, if the rain stops, I'll give you a fight. I'll give you more fight than your men can handle. The rain stopped. John gathers his men and he stands there and he says, there are your enemies, boys, the Hessians and Tories. We're victorious today, or tonight Molly sleeps a widow. Well, Molly didn't end up a widow, so they were victorious at Bennington. They took prisoners. The cannon, New Boston, New Hampshire, still has one of the cannons that were captured, as does the Bennington Museum in Bennington, Vermont. Then Stark marches north to Saratoga. He goes to Schuylerville. And he stops Burgoyne's retreat. So Burgoyne had to fight the second battle of Bennington. And it's called Corking the Neck, because Stark troops were on the other side of the bridge, and Burgoyne couldn't get across from Saratoga to retreat, so they had to turn around, which led to the surrender, which gave the inspiration for the American colonists for the rest of the war, and also impressed the French, and that allowed Ben Franklin to get their financial support for the remainder of the war. Stark's in several other battles. He commanded the Northern campaign, Northern Army in 3 different campaigns. And then once the war's over, he returns to Manchester and works the sawmill. What was his wife's name? Come on. That wasn't Molly. It's a trick question. Her name was Elizabeth Page. Molly's a term of endearment, like sweetheart. So there was a lot of Mollys, only one Elizabeth Page. So in 1809, about 60 veterans of the Battle of Bennington wrote a letter to Stark requesting his presence for a reunion. And Stark writes back and he says, you know, I'm old now. I wouldn't be anything to show off to these young people who were just in the cradle when I was born, when I was serving, barely born themselves. So he says, I can't do it. My rheumatism is such that I can't make the ride. Now, he used that excuse a lot. If he didn't want to go somewhere, he had rheumatism. Pretty good, you know. But if he wanted to go to the tavern on the other side of Amoskeag Falls, he didn't have a problem getting there. The minister would give him a ride. They all like to listen to the stories. So at the end of that letter, he signs John Stark, and with a salutation, he signs, what did he say? It's live free or die. In all the books, the quote is wrong. It's live free or die. Death is not the greatest of evils. All the quotes you see are written down, it says worst. They didn't use that word in the 18th century. Worst was not a word. We've adopted that later now because we're all pessimistic, I guess. So, live free or die, death is not the greatest of evils. And he died in 1822 at the age of 93 years old. And he's buried in Manchester. And the DAR owner's house has been moved from River Street up to Elm Street. Any questions? Nobody read the book, so how can I have a question? Well, thank you then.